Friends, more than 200 Ukrainian drones and missiles attacked Russia and annexed Crimea last night. Oh my god, I hope no one was hurt. Jeez, there was just smoke. Jeez. The most interesting thing is that Moscow and the Moscow region were attacked, and the Domodedovo and Zhukovsky airports are temporarily closed. The Dyagilevo and Saky airfields were attacked, and Dyagilevo houses strategic aviation, whose aircraft terrorize Ukraine almost every night. There is information about damage to TU aircraft. Drones also crashed into Moscow apartments. Skyscrapers and high-rise buildings are burning in Moscow and the Moscow region. There is a serious statement from the governor. He is furious. And President Zelensky said that we will now strike 3,000 kilometers deep into Russian territory. Strikes on Moscow and the Moscow region, strikes on other regions, power plants that are currently shut down because we are blowing up power plants in the Smolensk, Belgorod, and Rostov regions. We will discuss all this with the well-known military analyst Roman Svitan. Roman Grigorievich, welcome.
Thank you. I wish everyone good health. Roman Grigorievich.
The hottest news right now is Moscow and the Moscow region. Kind Ukrainian drones and missiles attacked today. Apartments in the Moscow region are on fire because, as I understand it, Russian air defense tried to shoot down the drones but failed. So everything ended up flying into Russian apartments. Muscovites are complaining. What do you think?
Well, the operation was carried out before the drone entered. I didn't see any missiles there, at least no missile. No one has confirmed that. And yes, the drones did approach Moscow, and in the Krasnogorsk area, they at least tried to carry out a certain combat mission. There's an industrial facility there. It's outside the ring road. It's to the southwest of Moscow, outside the ring road, beyond the air defense perimeter of the Russian capital. Either they wanted to enter Moscow from that side, or they were specifically targeting Krasnogorsk. Just to clarify, Moscow's air defense. At the moment, they have two main targets and two sites, Moscow and the Kerch Bridge. These two sites are not completely covered. Well, there are 3 or 4 layers of defense of different levels, but it's still difficult for drones to reach, for example, the city center. The thing is, it's 500 kilometers to Moscow with a range of 150 to 200 kilometers per hour. That's 3 to 4 hours, especially if you approach along a certain radius, it means our drones have to spend 3 to 4 hours hovering over Russian territory. And naturally, they come under attack from mobile groups, helicopters, light aircraft, fighter jets, and of course, air defense missile systems. And that's just to get there. Once you actually enter Moscow itself into the air defense ring, you risk being destroyed by Russian air defense systems stationed there. They're on high alert in that area. You can see them, Muscovites notice them there. The Panzer systems are raised on special platforms so that the radio horizon is a bit lower, allowing them to intercept low-flying targets. In other words, breaking through to Moscow with drones is practically impossible. The only way this could be done is if not just 100 drones or dozens of drones are sent toward Moscow, but hundreds. At least 300 to 400 would be needed. Losing drones while breaking through Moscow's air defenses is essentially the saturation coefficient for the air defense of the Russian capital. And after 300, those remaining could already get through and complete their combat mission. But that's the total number needed, somewhere over 300, probably closer to 500 drones. They need to be gathered and sent specifically toward the capital. And then some of the drones will get through and accomplish some kind of mission, well, to cause a scare, of course. Maybe like this time, it's more about, as I said, causing a scare. Why? Because it wasn't so much the drones that scared Muscovites, but rather Moscow's own air defense systems. Why? Because operating air defense in densely built up areas, especially among high rises, is actually very dangerous for the local population. So that's the kind of effect you get specifically in the direction of Moscow. But in reality, to really hit Moscow, you need ballistic missiles. In other words, without ballistic missiles, it's practically impossible to break through Moscow's air defense using aerial targets. Roman
Grigorievich, we're attacking the thermal power plants very intensively, the Smolensk TPP and other TPPs. You're saying that all of this is aimed at Moscow. So the key goal is to leave Moscow without electricity and eventually without heat and water?
Moscow, why specifically Moscow? Moscow is the metropolis. In the Russian Federation, Moscow is the metropolis, and all the other territories are, by and large, colonies, which at some point, sooner or later, was seized by Muscovy. So basically, they're all colonies. That's why, in order to exert pressure, naturally, Muscovy is trying to seize the next colonies. Where are decisions made? In Moscow. Where are the main means of decision-making located? In Moscow. And the Rublevka banner, where is it? In Moscow. After all, we can't do without the Rublevka banner. So the point is that striking at the capital itself, at the metropolis, will, first of all, eventually give the colonies a chance to break free. Finally, this prison of nations will fall apart, at least its constituent republics. So this mechanism is only possible. That is, such actions are only possible after strikes specifically on Moscow. You can basically forget about the rest of the territory of the Russian Federation in terms of carrying out strikes. If it's for pressure, just hit Moscow. In other words, that's the optimal option. Moreover, the population of Moscow and Ukraine is now roughly the same. More than half of our population has left Ukraine. About 20 million remain in Ukraine now, and there are 20 million in Moscow. Those Muscovites who, by and large, have sicked their colonies on us. This is just for understanding. Of course, we can debate it, but it's to grasp the process. That's why the strikes need to be targeted specifically at Moscow. And the recent strikes on combined heat and power plants, thermal power stations, and pumping substations, the power facilities that transfer electricity, connecting certain regions, indicate that the very geography of the strikes shows that right now, around Moscow, in a wide radius, hundreds of kilometers, we are targeting the so-called electric technology corridors that can be reached. You can't reach them in Moscow itself, but at a distance of several hundred kilometers, it's possible. That's why several thermal power plants, combined heat and power plants, and substations themselves have already been destroyed. When you hear about a substation of 500 kilovolts and above, 500, 750, that's exactly what supplies power to Moscow. And several such stations have already been taken out, and this will continue. In other words, until we go all the way around Moscow, maybe even several times, until all these 8 technological corridors, which aren't just about electricity, but also gas, are dealt with. Gas supply, oil supply, and of course, the pipelines that pump diesel and gasoline into Moscow, those exist too, coming from the direction of Mozyr, that is from Belarus, and from the direction of Ryazan. These are all precisely technological corridors. And now the strikes on Smolensk, that's even the western side. Before they were hitting the southeast and east, but now they've started on the western side because Smolensk is also one of the technical corridors. That's why preparations are underway, like a blackout for Moscow, and it will definitely happen. Right now, all our forces and resources need to be focused specifically on this task, to take Moscow out, so to speak, to switch off the metropolis, like turning off the lights in a bathhouse to cut off their energy. It's possible, and this absolutely needs to be done. And at the same time, without reducing the strikes on Russia's oil industry. Why? Because it's very important for us to do these things in parallel. Continue striking Russia's oil and gas sector and start focusing on strikes against Moscow. Mirror strikes on Moscow will actually stop the strikes on Ukraine. When a blackout happens there a couple of times, and we're talking about several tens of millions of people in one place, just imagine if they have to use the bathroom in the morning without water, without flushing, and without electricity. First of all, it won't end up where it's supposed to, and then it won't go anywhere. And after a couple of days like that, and then that Russian spirit, as we said, will spread all the way to the Urals, and I don't need another Chernobyl. They'll scatter in all directions anyway. Maria.
Nikolaevna, everyone is writing that there were serious explosions in Chelyabinsk. At the plastics factory, there are a huge number of casualties. The factory belongs to the Rostec State Corporation. It produces ammunition and explosives. They're saying this is actually a record distance within Russia. It's unclear whether it was partisans, concerned citizens, or special services. But this is a very important military facility. And for several days now, our audience has been asking us to discuss this.
This is in Kopaisk, near Chelyabinsk. That's the southern Urals. It's practically Kazakhstan already. Kazakhstan is right nearby. It's 2,000 kilometers away. It's possible to reach it with drones. We have drones that can go that far. These are our light aircraft, which converted into drones, operate via satellite navigation, and can carry, let's say, at least a 100-kilogram aviation payload there. FAP 100 or AFAP 100 are used specifically for these kinds of missions. The Russians are not confirming the presence of drones. The most interesting thing is I think there were drones that either were launched directly from Russian territory or from Kazakh territory. The Kazakhs are our friends. They're a brotherly people, and in principle, they could have helped us in this regard. Or it could have been the work of our own concerned confidants, our special services or resistance forces, which are currently being used, for example, by our special services to carry out combat missions. At this range, it's absolutely not a problem. That is 2,000 kilometers. Chelyabinsk is quite a significant site. Of course, you can find our people there who would carry out this task of destroying a military facility. These are real military personnel. Moreover, in this Kopeisk, starting from Chaika 2, if anyone remembers, Chaika was a washing machine that was produced on the upper floors, while on the inner underground floors, they produced army, or rather military equipment. That's exactly what's happening there now. So knowing all these processes since the Soviet Union, they managed to get there. At the very least, let's talk about those who cared enough to stop the technological cycle of military equipment production. That's the minimum. Working at such factories, at military plants for civilians, let's put it mildly right now, you need to be cautious. Why? Because all military facilities for some time, obviously for a long time, but they will be destroyed on Russian territory. For now, it's on Russian territory, although we already see destruction happening as well. To economic targets, since the entire Russian economy is working for the military, facilities in Hungary, Romania, for example, where Russian factories are burning, or factories that use Russian oil. That's why these processes will definitely continue to expand. We have a very small number of special services that deal with this issue. The Foreign Intelligence Service, the Main Intelligence Directorate, the Security Service, Special Operations Forces, and the Border Guard Intelligence. The Air Force, the Navy, which also have their own intelligence units, and they definitely have a long reach. That is, there are up to about 10, including several other covert intelligence agencies. We have up to 10 structures that can carry out such tasks, and they will do so. Therefore, civilians, especially ethnic Ukrainians with Ukrainian roots, should not be working at military factories right now. They will definitely be destroyed by various means, by drones, by concerned informants, by direct special service groups, or by missiles, because after all, we are still expecting missiles.
When President Zelensky says that we have missiles capable of striking targets 3,000 kilometers deep into enemy territory and that Tomahawks will be coming soon, what exactly does he mean, Roman Grigorievich?
Well, it's good that they have missiles, but it's bad that we don't have any because we don't see them. I don't know, maybe they've stashed them somewhere on Bankova Street. Well, then they need to take them out and launch them, finally use those missiles to hit targets 3,000 kilometers away. What is 3,000 kilometers? That's the Yamal cross, where you could really put a big solid cross, so to speak. Why? Because that's basically Russia's gas artery. 17 gas pipelines converge at that one spot, the Yamal cross. That's where you could send the missile 3,000 kilometers away. What else is 3,000 kilometers? The Omsk oil refinery, that's another 1,500 kilometers east of Chelyabinsk. So that's also towards Kazakhstan, closer to Kazakhstan. I mean, in the northeast direction from Kazakhstan. In other words, the Omsk oil refinery is the largest oil refinery in Russia. It processes 21 million tons per year. That's where you would need to reach, because the combat radius of missiles that could reach 3,000 kilometers, well, it covers, I would say, most of the territory of Russia where the main military and economic facilities are located. That's exactly 3,000 kilometers, roughly from the Yamal cross in the north to the Omsk oil pipeline and further south to the plant. That would be enough to completely stop Russia's economy. And after that, the Russian Federation, the prison of nations, would collapse. So yeah, it's good that there are missiles on Bankova, but it's bad that Ukraine doesn't have them. And it's also bad that we haven't used them yet. Technically speaking, we could indeed have Tomahawks, that's for sure, absolutely. What I mean to say is, if we were told right now at this very moment that we would be given Pershings or Minutemen, I would still nevertheless be extremely cautious. You see, even with such offers, caution is always necessary.
Explain to our audience what these missiles are, because not everyone knows, not everyone is aware.
The Minuteman is an intercontinental ballistic missile, which of course we could have made ourselves. We used to have missiles like the Satan, the SS-18. And what's good about the Minuteman is that it's a missile that's as old as I am. They started producing it back in the 1960s. I was born in 1964. So however old I am, I'm already in my late 50s, almost 60. And that's exactly how old this missile is. But it's an excellent missile. It has a range of 15 to 16,000 kilometers. It could reach as far as Pyongyang and Beijing. The warhead, well, it used to split into 3 parts, but now there's only one left. So it could deliver over a ton of warhead payload. Well, it's basically designed for nuclear warheads. Well, without any problem, you could load a 1-ton warhead onto it, equip it, and send it to Kim Jong-un as a gift. Now, he started an alley of fame, so to speak, for heroes who died or fought against Ukraine, whether on Ukrainian soil, Russian soil, or even in Europe. It doesn't matter. He started building bridges there too. So you could have just dug him that alley of fame right away with that missile. Amen Atman isn't because the Pershings are practically gone. Amen Atman is about the fact that, in principle, we could be making this ourselves, especially since it's a solid fuel rocket. So since it's solid fuel, that means you don't have to mess around with liquid fuel and all the serious problematic logistics that come with supplying that kind of missile. That's the level we're talking about, but no one is going to give it to us. Well, that's obvious. It's a heavy missile, and frankly, there's really no point in even talking about it. But as for Tomahawks, that's possible because it's a cruise missile that can be launched from launchers that already exist, ground-based ones like the Typhoons. And in principle, if a decision were made to give us these Tomahawks, we could learn to use them pretty quickly. Not half a year like Trump tells fairy tales about. It wouldn't take half a year to learn on those either. On anti-aircraft missile systems, that is, on Patriots, it also doesn't take half a year to learn. We were trained in 6 days, roughly in a month and a half. It's the same situation here. And then, in principle, in a month or a month and a half, we could have learned to operate these Tomahawks. By the way, I wouldn't be surprised if they eventually let us use them. Of course, it's clear that they won't give us thousands or even hundreds of Tomahawks, but a few dozen could be transferred. We could use these Tomahawks to strike military targets at a depth of up to 1,500 kilometers. They would reach most military targets with these missiles. Of course, this wouldn't lead to any significant changes or a turning point in the fighting or the war itself, but the Russians would definitely get a few more gray hairs from it. So let's just wait. There's no need to give up on the idea of getting those Tomahawks. Hope dies last after all, so we can wait. I think somehow, someday, Roman.
Lenkovich, the Dyagilevo airfield was attacked. And it so happened that at first, Putin demonstrated nuclear exercises, launches of strategic bombers capable of carrying nuclear warheads. He showed all of this off. The exercises took place in Kamchatka in the direction of the United States. So they showed everything they wanted to show. And then the following night, the armed forces of Ukraine attacked the Dyagilevo airfield. That's where the enemy's strategic aviation is located, which periodically carries out terrorist strikes on Ukrainian territory. What do you think about our strikes on Dyagilevo?
It was a combined attack. The main strike targeted the Ryazan oil refinery. Dyagilevo is in Ryazan, and the strike was aimed at the Ryazan oil refinery. This is one of the largest plants in Russia, processing 15 to 17 million tons per year. It's slightly smaller than the Omsk plant and is located in Ryazan. In order to reach it, the optimal approach would be to neutralize the air defense systems, the anti-aircraft missile complexes that cover the Ryazan oil refinery, but are actually located on the Dyagilevo airfield grounds, that is, at the Dyagilevo airbase. By the way, it is also located within the city limits of Ryazan. Moreover, right next to the airfield, practically on the same site, there is also an aircraft repair plant. In fact, Dyagilevo is a kind of retraining center for the flight crews of Russian strategic aviation. There are several serious aircraft stationed there. The Tu-22M3, which launches the Kh-22 missiles, and the Tu-95. So it is precisely there that flight crews undergo retraining or recover after long breaks. In other words, it's a retraining center. But specifically on the airfield itself, there is radar deployed, and there are Russian air defense systems covering this direction. And that's why there was a tandem attack. First, a strike on the radars, the air defense systems, and the airfield's technical equipment. And then a strike was carried out on the Ryazan oil refinery. They stopped the technological process, at least at one of the AVT units.
Roman Grigorievich, what could have hypothetically been damaged at the Dyagilevo airfield?
Definitely the Tushkas, the Tu-22M3, Tu-95. That's one of the main objectives. Aerodrome technical equipment of various types, meaning radio navigation stations, beacons, the so-called control tower. There are also a lot of SAM systems and radars there. Radars of the radio technical troops. They deploy them there to expand the area of airspace control. So this direction is quite well covered in Ryazan. I understand that both the Dyagilevo military facility and the economic facility, the Ryazan oil refinery, are very important. By the way, that's true for Moscow as well. Why is that? Because Ryazan pumps diesel to Moscow through the product pipeline, just like the Moser oil refinery pumps through the same LPD-8M. We talked about this with you through Netapovici, which was targeted. Magyar once struck in the opposite direction. Oil is pumped there as a gesture of friendship, and diesel is pumped back from Moser. The Ryazan oil refinery does the same. This is another technological corridor. There was also a third task, preparing for a blackout in Moscow. We'll see. Maybe one day we'll live to see that too. The star hour is probably closer to the new year, closer to that time.
You would really like to see this. 2 explosions in the area of the Saky airfield and in Novofedorivka. Let's start with the Saky airfield. It seems to me that almost every month, twice a month, we systematically hit the Saky airfield. There shouldn't be anything left there by now, Roman Grigorievich.
That's not quite the case. I also think that the airfield itself is very large. And in order to cover it all, let's say, or all the buildings, all the airfield technical equipment at the airfield, you would need several runs by more than one squadron of bombers, dropping free-falling aerial bombs. Hundreds of bombs would have to be dropped in order to completely disable, say, one of the airfields. It's not that simple, especially when it comes to concrete piercing aerial bombs, as they're called, and also volumetric detonating and concrete piercing bombs. All of this needs to be used specifically on the airfield in order to completely shut it down. While we're striking this airfield, meaning we're able to reach it to hit this airfield, or like it happened in 2022, remember, 3 ballistic missiles hit there. I think those were the Grom missiles, and they took out 12 Russian planes that were parked in one spot. So when on this parking area, yes, those 3 missiles, just think of it as 3 aerial bombs, but you'd need hundreds of those to completely write off the airfield. For now, as long as we don't have ballistic missiles there, and for some reason we don't, even though we keep hearing a lot of announcements, but announcements are just announcements, there are no ballistic missiles. For now, it's mostly either our drones going there, some of which the Russians definitely shoot down, or for example, missiles of the same class. They do reach the target and in principle accomplish their combat mission. We're trying to take it out to somehow knock out the radars. Again, it's the same situation as near Dyagilevo. That is, there are plenty of radars, surface-to-air missile systems, communication centers, and communications there. And this is Saky, it's near Novofedorivka, which is actually the airfield. A depot, a munitions depot, that is an arms depot for Russian naval aviation. This direction is very important for us. That's why we'll keep working on it, although this is actually preparation for gaining air superiority over Crimea, and most likely for a serious attack on military targets in Crimea. So after these kinds of attacks, after the enemy's radars and air defense are taken out, then comes the push towards on military targets, like when there were strikes near Feodosia, or for example, the second oil depot near Simferopol, which was also destroyed. So most likely in the near future, we'll be discussing another such serious military attack.
Roman Igorovich, Novofedorivka has been attacked again. I've already lost count of how many times we've hit it. It's constantly burning and exploding.
Novofedorivka and Saky are basically the same location. So a strike on Saky is a strike on Novofedorivka. In one place, there's an airfield. In another, there's an ammunition depot specifically for this naval aviation. The Russian Federation's naval aviation is based at the Saky airfield in Novofedorivka. They moved there and basically filled the depots with all kinds of weaponry. That's why we're trying to reach it, to trigger a detonation.
Roman Nikolaevich, there's some interesting news from the North Sea. It was reported that for the first time, a historic event occurred when NATO ships, together with their allies, specifically the British Royal Navy, for the first time on a direct order from NATO, intercepted a Russian warship in their waters. Sky News reports this. The destroyer HMS Duncan and a Wildcat helicopter stopped the large anti-submarine ship Vice Admiral Kulakov. In the North Sea, with the support of the French Navy and a Dutch November Hotel 90 helicopter. Roman Nikolaevich, why is it the first time? I think there have been many such provocations, but right now it's being called a historic event.
Well, it's definitely not the very first time this has ever happened. Rather, it's much more likely to be the first time in recent memory, specifically, let's say, during the period marked by the escalation of Russian aggression against Ukraine. Yes, that's correct. There have been many interceptions and escorts. All Russian ships are escorted through the English Channel. So this is, so to speak, a standard procedure in the Baltic Sea. But in the North Sea, it seems that the Russians have only just started to move in. This could have been a provocation, or perhaps it was a combat mission to determine, for example, whether there were any reconnaissance satellites nearby at that time. Or, for instance, reconnaissance aircraft like the Il-18 or Il-20 could have been loitering nearby to determine the algorithm of actions and interactions of NATO forces and assets in intercepting a Russian ship. In other words, sometimes the Russians create these provocations in order to figure out how the enemy operates, so that later, naturally, when carrying out a real combat mission, they can be prepared for the enemy's counteraction algorithms. And that's why the situation is complicated, just like with the drones that the Russians have sent across Europe and continue to send to this day. Some of the drones are mapping out what's called a digital map of targets, while others are used in a provocative mode, but their purpose is to determine from which airfield, at what speed, through which, and after how much time the planes take off to intercept, and so on and so forth. The algorithm of actions is being mapped out so that analysts can present analytical reports to the command regarding countermeasures or future provocations. Because this is most likely yet another provocation by the Russian Northern Fleet intended to force NATO ships, or rather NATO structures, to respond with an interception. Well, the Russians have copied it. It's just that NATO is self-satisfied. They need to understand that they have to constantly change their algorithms. The Russians will always adapt. Right now, there is active combat work going on, and the Russians are adapting very quickly. That's why they probably need to feed even more disinformation into the minds of those same analysts, so that their brains just melt from all that disinformation. Well, that's an entire military approach. I think they know, NATO generals definitely know all this science.
Roman Grigorievich, and one more thing. Is it news, a provocation, or a signal? Off the coast of the German city of Lübeck, a Russian landing ship has been stationed there for several days now. According to the publication Keeler, the Russian Navy vessel Alexander Shabalin has dropped anchor near the island of Fehmarn. The ship remains outside Germany's territorial waters, but is under constant surveillance by patrol vessels of the maritime police. The 119-meter vessel has been cruising the Baltic Sea for several months, repeatedly appearing near tanker routes or just 12 kilometers off the coast of the Danish island of Langeland. And this happened both during incidents involving drones and in Danish airspace. In other words, it is being linked to the appearance of drones. Security experts believe that Moscow is deliberately choosing strategically important areas of the Baltic to demonstrate military presence near transport and energy routes. What do you think?
The Baltic Sea now, after Sweden and Finland joined NATO, has become almost an internal NATO sea. And Denmark, why are the Russians in principle putting pressure on the Danes constantly? Denmark is the gateway to the Baltic Sea, the entrance and exit. Just as Turkey is to the Black Sea, Denmark plays a similar role for the Baltic Sea. That's why the Russians are drifting around the Baltic Sea like manure in an ice hole from one shore to another. And at this point, all the shores are hostile to them. That is, these are NATO shores. Of course, there's Kaliningrad region somewhere near St. Petersburg, and there's still on the Russian coastline, but in reality, the entire Baltic Sea is now essentially an internal sea of NATO countries. And for the Russians, it's, to put it mildly, quite difficult to conduct military operations, reconnaissance missions, or provocations there. As you'd expect, they're immediately intercepted. Nevertheless, they still try. Why is there Russian activity in the Baltic Sea? Right now, they're trying to load oil onto tankers. They're shipping oil. They're loading oil onto tankers. This service is operating and Primorsk is working. Primorsk is functioning as a port for shipments. After that, the tankers need to be escorted. Most of these tankers belong to the so-called gray fleet, and they get intercepted. So the Russians are trying to build an entire route, for example, with reinforcement from warships in order to be able to intercept in time or to support one of the tankers, which mainly serve the Russian economy, specifically the Russian war economy. It's a predictable event that the Russians will keep acting aggressively until the NATO forces sink one of their ships. That possibility also exists because they might make a mistake, especially after the weekend when they're hungover. They might realize they've ended up not in St. Petersburg, but somewhere in Finland. That happens with the Russians. And after that, actual combat operations will begin. That's why they're provoking a response. For now, they're just provoking. But of course, the NATO forces need to understand that the Russians are still studying the algorithm for countering the Russian Baltic Fleet.
Roman Leonidovich, to wrap up, Magyar has reported in. The Bryansk chemical plant, which was struck last night, is a key frontline industrial repair base. According to Magyar, they repair and restore heavy equipment there, produce ammunition, rocket launchers, and components for cruise missiles that are used at the front. It was successfully attacked. What do you think?
The Bryansk chemical plant produced rocket fuel for various types of missiles, and that's the main reason why it should have been taken out a long time ago. Based on the video footage that Russian public channels themselves posted, missiles like Storm Shadow or Scalp were used there. Whether it was just one or several, at least one was definitely captured on video and posted online. So we can say that this was a coordinated attack on the Bryansk chemical plant. The range there is just over 100 kilometers. They reached it, completed the combat mission, and have already put a big fat cross on the Bryansk chemical plant. They really did repair equipment there, including MLRS equipment. For us, this is very important. It's best to take it out right at the repair sites. The combat mission was accomplished. Well, Madyad is our Ukrainian Cossack. He has Hungarian blood. But Ukrainian Cossacks have all kinds of blood in them. I myself have 7 different bloodlines. From Polish, Jewish to Ural. There's Greek, Tatar, all sorts. But the thing is, you have to be a Cossack in spirit. Madyad is our Cossack. Even if he has Hungarian blood, it doesn't matter.
Roman Nikolaevich, and finally, at the beginning, there was information from the Wall Street Journal that the US has lifted a key restriction on Ukraine's use of long-range missiles supplied by allies, which will allow the armed forces of Ukraine to strike targets deep inside Russia. Then Trump distanced himself from this, but others said, well, we didn't actually lift the restrictions, so go ahead and carry out the strikes. Then more information appeared, and Zelensky confirmed that Moscow, St. Petersburg, Yaroslavl, and dozens of other major Russian cities are now within range of Ukrainian missiles. What do you have to say about this?
Well, as for Trump, he flip-flops just like the Russian or Baltic fleet, drifting around like manure on an ice hole. Everyone has already talked about this. In the morning, he says one thing, in the evening, another. In the morning, he gives, in the evening, he takes back, and the next day, he forgets what he gave, and so on and so forth. So in this sense, it's better not to pay too much attention to Trump. Let him keep blabbering on. After all, it's his age. But real actions, for example, after working with tomahawks and scalps, like with the Bryansk chemical plant, show that it's the actual deeds, the so-called facts, that prove we can strike with European weaponry. Yes, for now, not with American weapons, but we can strike with European ones since we've already carried out a combat mission. And since we can strike, I think, though I don't know about Yaroslavl or Moscow because the range is still 500 kilometers. So tomahawks and scalps won't reach that far. That's if the Taurus missiles are brought in. Yes, the Taurus could theoretically reach Moscow, hypothetically at least, but you'd still have to launch it practically from our northern borders, get close to the border safely. So there are a number of range limitations, at least in terms of combat radius. But the fact that there are currently no restrictions on the use of European weaponry, that's already something. We want to state this fact, and this fact is also confirmed by Madyar, whom we absolutely trust, as well as by the Russians, who clearly identified the strike on the Bryansk chemical plant. We're definitely waiting, and if you want an encore, by all means, we can stand up and applaud, if only there was something to applaud for.
Friends, please like this video and write a few kind words in support of Ukraine in the comments. Together with the well-known military expert and Norwegian Roman Svitan, we discuss current events 3 times a week on my YouTube channel, Dasha Schastliva. Roman Grigorievich, thank you, and as always, see you next week.
Goodbye.